Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. Are women's rights on the decline? Looking at the headlines from around the world, it might seem so, but my guest this week says if you zoom out, the trend lines are actually much better than you imagine. We will explore. As always on FP Live, we'll take some questions from our subscribers. If you want to join in, become a subscriber now. You can get 50% off your first payment. We're also a free podcast. Find us wherever you get your audio. One more plug. We have an Ask Me Anything episode coming up next week. Send in your questions right here on the site or by emailing us at live@foreignpolicy.com. So, there are several real reasons to worry about women's rights. There's the decline in democracy globally, the overturning of abortion rights here in the United States, and the continuing underrepresentation of women in top leadership roles around the world. My guest this week says these setbacks are real, but they're also inspiring a fight back in a range of different countries. In an essay in Foreign Policy last month, Lyric Thompson documented how countries such as Mexico, Chile, Spain, Liberia, and Mongolia are all taking concrete steps to expand women's leadership. Thompson is the founder and CEO of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative. She's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University, and she joins me now. Lyric, welcome to FP Live.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with the basics. When you say women's rights are winning, it can feel counterintuitive. What are people missing here?
Yes, well, I have to say I was pretty surprised myself. So this headline comes from a year of research that I've been conducting with my colleagues at the collaborative, where we looked at every country around the world who has announced, or as you mentioned, in some cases, renounced a feminist foreign policy, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we do a global status update. How's it going? What's going on? And given the headlines, and as you described, going into this exercise, I really thought this was going to be the beginning of the end of this project because the bad news feels overwhelming. And then we were shocked to find across the globe, in every UN region, progress proliferating and in a number of cases as a direct response to setbacks. And that is a really important story to tell because otherwise our narrative of progress is incomplete. We can receive defeat as final when in fact women's movements are learning from these setbacks, they're organizing, and they're coming back and they are effectively making progress in places that we just don't hear about because if it bleeds, it leads. And if you're just chipping away at the ick, that doesn't get as much coverage. So it's our role to
Mhm.
tell that story.
And give us a couple of examples. So I know in the piece you mentioned Mexico, Chile, Spain. Talk to us just a little bit about the trend lines you're seeing.
So there's a solid trend line on women's political representation, which is to say countries are taking concrete steps, whether that is through quotas, whether that is through affirmative action policies, whether that is through presidential commitments to do everything from have 50% women cabinets to achieving 50% of women in the legislature, as Mexico has, and as most people are familiar. Also winning head of government and in the case of the foreign policy piece, committing to interviewing and accelerating female candidates in their diplomatic corps at a 2-to-1 ratio. So we know that this is an uphill battle. The numbers show us that it's going to take 130 years or something for for gender equality and political representation. But we have solutions, and these are the countries that are implementing them, and it works.
Hmm. Let's talk about one of those countries, so Mexico. And the country seemingly made a big advance when it elected Claudia Sheinbaum last year as its first female president. And then recently, there were these awful scenes of a man groping her in public. And you get this feeling of one step forward, one step back, and then here we are. But you're saying that's not how we should be seeing this. Tell us a bit about what happened here.
Her response was perfect, but not assured. So, as the first female president, she's under enormous pressure to look strong, to project strength, and also not to remind people too often that she's a woman. And so there would have been a clear pathway on the basis of those conditions and just gender norms being what they are, and the constraints on women in leadership, particularly when you're the first, to not report that, to just brush it off, to try to bury that incident as quickly as possible. And she was very uh, intentional in responding and saying, this is a problem that we have in Mexico, that we have in the world. 1 in 3 women in the world will experience physical or sexual violence in her lifetime. And if I do not report this, if I do not exercise and demonstrate confidence in the institutions that are obligated to treat this as a crime and to respond accordingly, then what example is that setting for the rest of the women in my country and globally? And I thought that was perfect and really important considering the fact that Mexico does have a femicide problem. Her predecessor had a real problem with addressing it. In fact, he asserted that it was a political hoax by his enemies who were trying to bring him down. So there was some question going into her presidency whether she too would take that line and diminish this as an issue. And her response was fantastic.
Hmm. I want to spend a minute just talking about the importance of the top job and what that does to representation more broadly in a country or company even. But staying with countries, for example, the role of president or prime minister. So Sri Lanka had the first female head of government in 1960, and staying in that region, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they've all had female leaders in Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, Khalida Zia, Sheikh Hasina. And each of these countries broke a glass ceiling, I think, before many Western countries did. And yet they actually don't fare so well on women's rights in general. So according to the World Economic Forum's gender gap rankings, Bangladesh is doing just about okay. It's 24th out of 148 countries, but Sri Lanka is 130th. India is 131st. Pakistan is dead last at 148th on that particular list. So what does all of that tell you about the sort of when you shatter a glass ceiling and you have a female leader at the very top, but progress isn't even across the board?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as we as Americans know, the election of Barack Obama should not be read in the United States as an indication that we've eliminated racism. Similarly, the election or appointment of women leaders in countries where women as a body are not are not thriving, are being prevented from exercising their full human rights, um, should not be read as an indication that sexism has been solved in those countries. Presidencies are important and visible institutions, and other women leaders will say how important it was to have a mentor, to see themselves in a leader, and that that is indeed path breaking and groundbreaking and does seed other interest and other folks to follow suit. But these are not a one-to-one with culture, which is much bigger, much more complex, and has these deeply seated isms baked very deeply in. It's going to take much more, including some of the proactive policy maneuvers that we know work, such as quotas, such as affirmative action, to really tackle this on a larger number, because this is a numbers game ultimately.
You mentioned culture there. Talk a little bit about how that interplays with progress on women's rights and then sometimes steps back as well. And I asked this question, knowing fully well that, this isn't about culture good, culture bad, but just about how it interplays in various ways around the world.
Sure. I mean, the culture of misogyny is universal, and the global glass ceiling is similarly global. I think the important thing to recognize here is that although different manifestations of, let's say, violence differ geographically, in some regions you have honor violence, in some regions you have higher incidences of child marriage or female genital mutilation. Here in the United States, we have the highest number of homicides from gun deaths, given the amount of guns in our society. Manifestations of violence differ, but the norm universally is that, as I mentioned earlier, 1 in 3 women will endure violence in her lifetime. So in each of our contexts, it's incumbent upon us to understand what solutions work to these issues. And the women's movement has been extraordinarily successful globally in knowing how these problems manifest in their context, organizing across religious lines, across ethnic lines, across partisan lines, and advancing solutions. So we do see that where there are more women in power, you do see a greater propensity for policymaking to reflect family-friendly priorities such as care, which is very much having a moment, particularly in Latin America right now. A lot of Latin American feminists are organizing either at the national level or in their regional bodies to assert caregiving as a right to provide care services for free. We also saw that as a very popular issue in the New York City election recently, and we also are going to see an all-female transition team there. So there is a correlation there. And between women's rights activists and then increasing numbers of women in political leadership, we do see these groups working together to tailor solutions that work.